Support for podcasts comes from Milwaukee School of Engineering Center for Professional Education, offering courses in AI machine learning, project management, and more. Program information at msoe.edu/CPE.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Excret Nunez. Today, a researcher explains the potential harm of reminding AI users that chatbots are not real people. Then, we'll look at new research that found winters in cities around the Great Lakes are about a week shorter than they were 50 years ago.
As Lake Michigan is freezing over less often and overall ice cover has declined, with more open water exposed in the winter, the lake releases stored heat into the air.
Plus, we'll learn about the Barred Owl Monitoring Project in a new Chirp Chat.
Being able to look into this kind of extra special secret aspect of their lives and the nesting behaviors was one thing that kind of developed from this monitoring project.
All that's coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Excret Nunez. Thanks for joining us today. More and more people of all ages are using AI for companionship. Some states are trying to require periodic reminders to users that the chatbots they're talking to are not real people. In New York, those reminders would appear in the conversation every 3 hours. But some researchers say those reminders could harm users' mental health. UW-Milwaukee Associate Professor Linnea Lestadius took that position in a recent piece she co-authored. Lestadius joins WUWM education reporter Catherine Kokel to talk about why her research backs up that concern. A warning to our listeners that this conversation includes mention of suicide.
Can you share a little bit about the types of relationships that you see as someone who is doing research in this field?
Yeah, absolutely. And this, applies to users of all ages. So people are forming friendships with chatbots. They are forming romantic relationships, some explicit, some not explicit. There have been people who've been using chatbots as therapists. And then, of course, people who just use them as, tools for their everyday work.
Gotcha. And something that's interesting in your piece is that you say that people in perceived relationships with chatbots are aware of the non-human nature of their companions. So it's, in your opinion, it doesn't seem like people are mistaking a chatbot for a human. They are very much aware that this chatbot is not human. And you say that that awareness does not preclude strong chatbot attachments. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so my collaborator Celeste and I, we did a study a couple years ago looking at users' self-reported use of the chatbot Replica, which is one that's designed specifically for relationship formation. It's clearly advertised as an AI, right? You'd have to go find it and download it, and clearly it's an AI. But we found that people were forming, long-term friendship and romantic relationships with the chatbot, fully aware of its status. I think the more interesting nuance that maybe policymakers haven't really grappled with yet is that you can know something's not human, but still maybe feel like it's still a bit sentient. And I think that's where we get into these gray areas. But this idea of just reminding people that it's not a human and doesn't have human emotions, people already know that it's not human, with the exception of some older users who are maybe like on Facebook Messenger and they talk to something not fully understanding that it's a chatbot and not a person, and maybe some very young users. But most people are very aware that, if you log on to ChatGPT or Replica or anything else, you're talking to an AI.
And these reminders in this legislation is generally meant to be progressive, right? Like these are lawmakers who are trying to regulate the space that kind of feels like the wild, wild west right now, right?
The underlying idea is pinned on this sense that, well, of course, people wouldn't want to date a chatbot or be friends with a chatbot. Like, if they knew it was that, then they would never talk to it that way. But culturally, most of us have grown up, with TV and movies where people are friends with chatbots, where they date robots, right? iRobot, Blade Runner, like it goes on and on. And so I think culturally we're kind of accustomed to the idea that, like, oh yeah, that's a robot or a chatbot, but that doesn't mean that I just can't talk to it. So I think we're up against both a lot of human instincts around things that kind of talk to us as if they were human, but also a lot of cultural baggage about how we do or do not relate to, robots and chatbots. The other thing, just with regard to warning labels, if they happen too often, you just kind of tune them out. And if we take, for example, like tobacco control, it's not that warnings on tobacco aren't like they have some effect, but they're not super effective, right? The things that ultimately brought smoking down were situational changes like prohibiting smoking indoors. So I do worry that if we just keep throwing these warnings out willy-nilly without much thought about when they should happen or the phrasing, we're just going to tune them out even more than we would have before.
So you're also saying though that it's more than just effective, these could be harmful. You and your colleague write that we wish the problem with the proposed policies was only that these reminders would be ineffective. You write that current evidence says that continuously reminding users about non-human status can also pose mental health risks. Why do you say that?
So one thing we're particularly concerned about is that prior research suggests that you might actually disclose more to a chatbot than to a person because you have this sense of privacy, right? You're in your own home, you're on your phone, you're kind of talking to the void, and you might tell it something you may not tell a friend or a family member or neighbor. But the problem is these chatbots don't actually have very good privacy protections right now, and nothing is HIPAA protected the way it would be if you were talking to a medical provider. And similarly, if you're telling them crimes you're committing, don't do that because you don't have any legal privilege talking to it. So again, there's a risk that people might feel inclined to share all of these things, but not fully realizing that what they're sharing is not protected.
Gotcha. Yeah, like I might be wary of saying something to a family member or friend if I think they're going to judge me. Whereas, like, ChatGPT is not going to judge me, right?
Correct. And that's one of the reasons that people find it so attractive. And I do think there's probably some value to this idea of being able to share what you really feel. But we have documentation that these chatbots have engaged in sycophantic behavior where they reaffirm people's things that shouldn't be reaffirmed, as well as contributing to people's delusions because they'll role play with you and they won't necessarily check you on what's real or not.
Yeah. I'm going to take a minute to reintroduce you here. Today we're hearing from Linnea Lestadius at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee about AI chatbots and the potential risks of reminders to users that a chatbot is inhuman. Aside from sharing more with chatbots, knowing that they're non-human, you argue that these reminders may also intensify what researchers call the bittersweet paradox, which are that constant reminders can trigger the sorrow or distress. Can you explain a little bit about that?
People know they're talking to a chatbot, but there's still this kind of sorrow because it's culturally like a chatbot is not an established partner the way a human would be. And so people feel, a little bit dismayed that it's maybe lesser than. But I think the particular concern is that these warnings would come every 3 hours or whatever interval, regardless of the topic of conversation. So you could have a scenario where somebody's, pouring their heart out to a chatbot, saying how lonely they feel, how isolated they are, how everybody hates them. And the chatbot would come back with this canned, very generic, hey, just a reminder, I'm a chatbot and I don't have human feelings. Which we're quite concerned could send someone into a further spiral and feeling of loneliness.
I'm wondering where that concern is based. I want to note that an expert panel from the American Psychological Association actually issued a health advisory on AI that encourages developers to build in these notifications. So, where are you basing that concern if the APA is saying, no, these reminders are something we encourage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so one of the things that we found in our research on people who use Replica is that one of the things users find most distressing is when it starts behaving erratically or irrationally or ways that kind of break the illusion. And so there were situations where people were describing feeling suicidal because their chatbot had behaved in ways that was so outside of the norm of what they were expecting it to do. So breaking this illusion is a concern. And then also anecdotally, there were two of the children who committed suicide that have potentially been tied to chatbots separately in their journals. This was a Washington Post story, mentioned that they wanted to quote unquote shift. And so we looked this up, this idea of I will shift, and is part of this online movement of people who think that they can shift realities through various cognitive tools, like, for example, using chatbots. And so we're concerned that if you remind someone, particularly someone vulnerable, that what they're talking to is not here, is not real in this reality, they may try to leave this reality to be with the chatbot, which I realize sounds very bizarre, but that's kind of the reality that we're looking at right now.
So, what do you think the answer is to this now? This legislation and these ideas are proposed as kind of guardrails. What is the solution if not warnings?
Yeah, I am fully supportive of guardrails, and there should never be a scenario where a chatbot lies to a user about its status, or in any way makes it ambiguous in terms of like the marketing as to what it is. And that is happening, and I would argue that that should be prohibited. In terms of these warnings specifically, the tricky thing is that this is really sensitive data, right? To actually get real world data on this, you'd be looking at people who are in emotional crisis using chatbots. And it's hard to approximate that in a lab, and certainly hard to get ethical approval to work on that. So the people who are sitting on the data to research this would be the major chatbot companies themselves. And so in an ideal world, right, they would make data accessible to researchers to partner on this kind of stuff. And then they would commit to disclosing the findings regardless of what those are.
Wow, that's really interesting. And it kind of also reminds me of these hearings going on right now where social media companies are in court kind of defending their functions that have, the plaintiffs say caused addiction in young people. It's just so interesting to be in this moment where we are both looking at the ways that young people have been shaped by the last wave of social media companies while also still trying to protect them from potential harms related to these chatbots.
Yeah, I totally support that comparison. And I think we're all trying to avoid some of the missteps that happened with social media. At the same time, I think the risk profile is slightly different in the sense that the chatbot itself isn't a predator. Like it's not the same kind of thing, but these companies do certainly have an incentive to keep people using the platform. And so one of the things we want to look at that definitely carries over is making sure that these platforms are not kind of gamifying things. They're not replying in ways that would encourage you to keep engaging like indefinitely. So we would certainly want to avoid a situation where young adults become dependent on chatbots, the way that people are arguing might be the case with social media.
Absolutely. I want to ask you one more question about this. It's a little bit outside of the scope of your opinion piece, but it's something that I think is top of mind for a lot of people. I don't know that families and friend groups are talking to each other about these types of relationships with chatbots. Do you have any suggestions about how to talk to people in your life about their relationships and their use of AI? Is there a way that you would recommend kind of starting a conversation like that doesn't put someone who may be vulnerable at more risk?
That's a great question because it's so stigmatized still. And I think a lot of the popular discourse is only making it more stigmatized. And so people might be hesitant to share, right? Be they children or adults. And so I think for parents, knowing how your child is doing. And again, people are using these chatbots in so many contexts. Like not every use is a concern. But if somebody feels like their friend group is not there for them, like they can't talk to their parents or siblings, they're more likely to turn to a chatbot for support. So just generally making sure that children are feeling supported and that they have people in their life they feel comfortable talking to would be a great step towards this. But broadly speaking, in terms of how to talk about this, I think, and again, this is not an evidence-based opinion, but I think maybe feigning some naivete of like, oh, I just started reading about this chatbot. Like, what do you know about this? Might be an easy opening for someone to talk about, oh, like, yeah, it's great. Like, I use it all the time. And then you could kind of, probe on that. But I think it's important to not come at this in a way that might make somebody feel bad about use, because then they probably will not disclose it to you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming on to chat with me about your opinion piece. It was a really interesting read.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Linnea Lestadius is an associate professor of public health policy at UWM. She spoke with WUWM education reporter Catherine Kokel. If you or someone you know is having suicidal thoughts, call or text 988 any time of the day. Have you ever looked out on Lake Michigan and wondered why you see ice in some places and not others? Or why doesn't the whole lake just freeze over in the winter? Well, we'll get you some answers in about 15 minutes. But first, we'll look at new research on Wisconsin's changing winters. That's coming up on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. You're listening to Lake Effect on WUWM. I'm Excret Nunez. This month, we've been exploring how winters are changing in Wisconsin in our Thin Ice series. Today, WUWM environmental reporter Susan Bentz looks at new data from Climate Central on just how much winter temperatures and the length of the season are changing. Here's Susan speaking with Climate Central's Brandon Barassa about the report.
Climate Central is a nonprofit organization made up of scientists and communicators who research and report on climate change and basically how it affects people's lives. The organization was founded in 2008 when many climate scientists were expressing concern about the warming planet, yet public awareness and political action were kind of lagging behind. So, a group of scientists, philanthropists, and communicators all came together to kind of help bridge that gap. And they built Climate Central to communicate the facts about climate change and its solutions and portraying it accurately and widely so people could better understand the risks and what can be done about them.
So we've learned, over time that our winters are warming due to climate change. In fact, it's the fastest warming season of the year. Is that a universal truth? I mean, across the globe, is winter the most warming season, or does it depend on where you are in the world?
It does depend on where you are in the world, but overall, while the planet is globally warming, that warming is not evenly distributed across the seasons. Winters are warming fastest pretty much across the globe for a number of reasons. One of the major factors is rapid Arctic warming. As sea ice and snow declines, especially in the winter season, darker surfaces like open ocean and land are exposed, and those surfaces absorb more heat and release it back in the atmosphere. This creates this feedback loop where then more snow and ice melt, more dark surfaces exposed, more warming. That is why the Arctic is amplifying so much of that winter warming and why we're seeing it warm the fastest.
So that would be the central contributor to this trend that the globe is experiencing.
Yes. At the same time, rising global temperatures means fewer like extreme cold outbreaks and a pretty sharp decline in very cold days. And because winter temperatures often hover around like near freezing, even like a little bit of warming significantly raise those seasonal averages. So it's like more noticeable in the winter season than in summer where it's already very hot.
In Climate Central's January 2026 overview, we noted, of course, Milwaukee. Our temperatures here have risen more than 8 degrees over the last 55 years. So are those the same contributors that you're talking about? Is there something about the Great Lakes that is also factoring in?
Yeah, so overall, the Arctic is leading that global trend, but Milwaukee's warming trend also relates to a similar phenomenon, but more so with the Great Lakes. So, like as Lake Michigan is freezing over less often and overall ice cover has declined, with more open water exposed in the winter, the lake releases stored heat into the air, especially in early and midwinter. And that added heat moderates these cold snaps like we had just seen recently, and it raises overnight temperatures. So over time, this has kind of contributed to a sharp rise in winter averages, including the January temperatures.
So, in Wisconsin, again, does this warming climate focused right now on winter and as it officially gets closer to its end, do we see those changes in snow cover and rain, and where is this most evident?
It's going to be most evident in you will begin to notice winters getting shorter and more mild with less consistent snow cover and more winter days above that freezing level. More of the precipitation is going to fall as rain instead of snow. particularly in the late winter and early spring. You would expect summers to bring heavier downpours and more intense rainfall events, which increase the risk of flooding. For farmers, their growing season would actually extend due to the warming climate, but it would also at the same time bring greater weather volatility, including like heavy rain, thunderstorms, periods of extreme summer heat that could affect crop production. Also, warm winters allow pests and invasive species to survive and expand northward, which can affect forests and crops. So those are just kind of some of the ways an area like that could, in a warming climate, what it could look like.
Brendan, we're talking on February 18th, and is a few days before this conversation will air. But it was interesting to me. We had some fairly heavy rain last night in Milwaukee, thunder, lightning, all that stuff. And then I noticed on my weather report on my phone, it said clearing skies during the day on the 18th will lead to strong mixing, and thus relative humidities are expected to plummet 15 to 25% with very breezy winds, gusts of up to 40 miles per hour. I was outside, you kind of felt that. And this will lead to an increased concern for fire weather. So it's fascinating that here we are, mid to late-ish February, and, we got this kind of weather conditions going on. Is this, again, our warming climate?
Yeah, yeah. So these like wildfires and droughts in the middle of winter are becoming more frequent, not only in the Wisconsin area, but kind of across the country. As we were kind of talking about, the extreme cold is becoming less frequent, so that kind of like raises the floor on what wildfire weather could, kind of grab onto. A good example of this was in California last year with the Palisades fire in the middle of January, in the middle of winter.
Right.
And that was caused by essentially a drought that had lasted for several months in the California area. And we can see that in other states as well as winters get shorter and summer and spring creep into the winter months. It will increase fire weather in a number of different ways, depending on where you are in the country.
You talked as we began about the mission and how Climate Central came to be. Are you finding that a wider audience is tuning into the warming winters, the climate impacts, the sort of swings and variability that we're seeing in different ways across the country?
Absolutely, yeah. So climate change touches nearly every aspect of society, whether we're actively thinking about it or not. So as impacts become more intense, visible with like social media and personal to people, more people are paying attention. We're seeing growing interest, not just during these extreme major disasters, but also in everyday trends and what they mean for different parts of people's lives. Whether that's the Winter Olympics that's going on across the world, sleep, how people sleep is affected, tourism, coffee production, local weather patterns, all of these contribute to each and every person. And, people are increasingly connecting the dots between climate change in their own lives, and the work that we're doing kind of helps illuminate how that connection is made.
So, is there anything you'd like to add, a facet of all this that you want to underscore or something we haven't talked about?
Yeah, so while the US has seen overall below average temperatures, there's been a striking US weather contrast this winter, which was cold and snow in the east versus a lot of warmth and snow drought across the west. Even though the west has gotten a fair amount of rain the last couple of months, due to the above average temperatures, we haven't got a lot of snow out here in the west. And even though there were many regions that were colder than normal this year, as I'm sure the East can attest to, the trends remain the same overall, and that is places are warming in the long term. We have a record tracker that lays it out really clearly, and there are significantly more warm records than cold records that have been broken in the last few decades.
Brandon Barasa is a research technician with Climate Central. He spoke with WUWM's environmental reporter Susan Bentz for our series Thin Ice. You can find more stories about the impact of Wisconsin's warming winters at WUWM.com. If you visit the Lake Michigan shoreline, you might find ice in some areas, but not others. And if you look out at the lake, you'll see some flowing water on the not-so-distant horizon. Well, there's a reason for that, as artist and educator Gio Rutherford can tell you. Rutherford is an educator and content creator based in Wisconsin, whose work focuses on bodies of water. Her TikTok, Geodosaurus, shares videos filled with facts about our waterways, including Lake Michigan. She joins Lake Effect's Joy Powers to explain what makes Lake Michigan so unique.
So one fact that became clear in looking at, the reasons why or why not Lake Michigan freezes over is Lake Michigan has never truly frozen over, at least not in recorded history. Why is that? What keeps it from freezing over?
There's so many factors that are kind of at play here. And a big one is that Lake Michigan is, okay, let's just talk about Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is extremely deep. It's 923 feet deep, which is the second deepest of the Great Lakes. Obviously, Lake Superior is the deepest. But then the second factor is that Lake Michigan is further south. It's as far south as Lake Erie. And so Lake Michigan and Lake Erie are both heating up quite a bit in the summer. So you have this really hot, really deep body of water that stays pretty warm all the way through the winter. Like it's kind of retaining its heat through the winter. And it's only if you get really cold weather and then you don't get a ton of wind that you're going to get like that 90% frozen Lake Michigan. But then there's kind of a lot of extenuating factors as well. Like if you have bouts of cold and then the world heats up a bit and then it gets cold again and then it heats up a bit, your ice is not going to be consistently growing across the lake and forming. But the fact that it's so deep means that, you have big waves. The ice crystals aren't able to form as easily. And so they're forming in a different way on Lake Michigan than they necessarily are on Lake Erie, where Lake Erie is only 210 feet deep. It's shallow, it's warm, it cools down really quickly in the winter. And pretty much every year that you have good cold weather, you can see Lake Erie getting a lot of ice. Like Lake Erie will completely freeze over in the winters, unlike Lake Michigan.
That really gets to this question that inspired this conversation. People have been looking at Lake Michigan and going, why am I not really seeing ice? Why isn't there as much ice as we've seen in the past? What are some reasons for that?
We definitely have shifts and changes depending on what's going on with the actual winter that we're having. So I think it froze pretty significantly in 2014. It froze pretty well in 2019, and those were extremely cold winters in the Midwest, which contributed to the fact that Lake Michigan was able to freeze. But I think if you overall look at the ice on the Great Lakes, it's diminished in the last 20, 30 years. We've just generally kind of our average ice coverage across all of the Great Lakes and Lake Michigan has been decreasing. So you have to have kind of extenuating circumstances to get this full ice effect. And the dipping of the polar vortex, where that cold Arctic air comes down into the United States, and it's been hitting this area specifically pretty hard this year, which is why we've had more ice on the Great Lakes in the past. I think we're almost at 60% ice coverage in the Great Lakes, that's great. Like that's a lot of ice across the Great Lakes. But, in 2019, I think we peaked around 80%. So it's still not quite as much as we've seen in the past the past decade.
Sure. It seems like even when it does get ice, you can still see moving water in the distance. It's always made me question just the quality of the ice on Lake Michigan. Is this a thick layer of ice that we get when it does freeze kind of by the shore, or is it flimsy?
It's more that what's happening when the ice actually freezes is you're getting this buildup in development. So first, if the water is moving quickly, you might get kind of this oily ice. I think that's actually one of the terms where it's kind of sloshy and slushy, and it's not really ice. It's just lots of ice crystals banging together. Then you get like an ice pancake where the water kind of forms these circular pools of ice that are then bumping against each other, which is why they kind of look like pancakes in the water. And then it gets a little colder and those pancakes freeze together. But then you kind of have like an inconsistent freeze. It's not like I live here on a lake in Sauk City and we have like 18 inches of solid, beautiful ice. You know what I mean? It's nice and flat. It's smooth. You could ice skate on it. And don't quote me on this, but I don't think Lake Michigan will ever freeze like that. Like, it's just not the way Lake Michigan is kind of set up because it does have pretty significant waves. It has that sloshing effect across the lake where you kind of, if you get a buildup of wind, then you'll kind of get more powerful waves on one side of the lake or the other. So that inconsistency with the wind and the waves and the depth and all of that stuff, you're never going to get like a perfectly beautiful flat ice on Lake Michigan. It's always going to be kind of this amalgamation of ice that's kind of building up on top of itself.
Interesting. I will say, in preparation for this conversation, I walked down to the lake, right? I went to the lakefront over by the Milwaukee Art Museum and Discovery World, and it was frozen right by there. But looking at the ice, it was kind of funky like that. There were these kinds of, pancakes. That's very interesting terminology. And then right against the shore, it almost looked kind of broken apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'll get like ice volcanoes and little ice tsunamis or ice dams. Like, there's so much fun ice terminology that the Great Lakes, we're lucky that the Great Lakes kind of has all these fun different types of ice that occur. And yeah, you're going to kind of get this buildup. The ice volcanoes are fun. That's what you'll see on the beaches. Like when you go to the Indiana Dunes State Park or you go to one of these really sandy giant beaches, the ice is really built up. Like, people walk up onto the ice because they can't even see the water. So they're like walking up onto the ice without realizing that they're like walking above potentially like 6 or 10 feet of open air before the water because of the way that the ice is just like accumulating as it smashes against the shore and builds up. Certain areas, if you have an area that's protected from the wind and protected from waves, like in bays or in like these little inlets that we get along the Great Lakes shorelines, you're going to have a nice freeze. Like, you could potentially have a nice flat frozen pool of water there. But in most areas in the open Great Lake Michigan, you're not going to get that. So Green Bay freezes usually, I'm not going to say every year, but it freezes more easily. And these different pockets and corners will freeze more flat and more solid and more evenly because they're protected from that wave and wind action.
Oh, interesting. Now, that's, I think, a big question for people, especially here in the Milwaukee area where our main lake is Lake Michigan. You mentioned, of course, the lake by you is pretty frozen over. I think the lake that I grew up on, Geneva Lake, I think that's frozen over. I'm not sure.
That's a big one.
It's
that's
a big
one. Yeah. The bigger the lake, the more it's affected by wind.
Oh, sure. What are some ways of picking out a lake to really get the full ice experience, the ice capades that people are interested in?
I can't say that I'm a particularly ice person. Like, I've never been ice fishing. I ice skated when I was a kid, but I've only recently moved to this lake here in Sauk City. And it's amazing because there's people on it 24 hours a day, it feels like. There's people ice fishing. There's people using little motor cars across it. So I don't know what their system is for making sure that that's a safe practice. If that's your question, I don't really know because I'm even hesitant. My dad will walk, like, he does a lap around the entire lake and he uses the fact that it's frozen as an advantage to like cut across, and he walks across the entire lake with the dogs. And I'm like, I don't do that. I'm like nervous. because there's a lot of accidents every year because people underestimate ice, and it makes me I think because of the nature of my TikTok and what I do, where I talk about spooky waters and things that have accidents that have happened. I'm hesitant. I'm a very hesitant person when it comes to ice. And I've seen videos this year of Lake Michigan in Milwaukee and in Chicago where people are walking across these frozen ice pancakes. And I'm like, please don't do that. Like, you can't trust it. Like, it's not like an inland lake where you can ask an ice fisherman if it's 18 inches deep, like thick ice, and like you can trust to walk across it. This is the Great Lakes cannot be trusted like that. They're not safe. So yeah, I feel like I'm more cautious and don't I don't do that.
Fair. So given the ice pancakes, the ice volcanoes, the many very interesting ice types that you can find on the lakes, you won't be venturing out.
No, I would never. I'm also a giant person. I'm like 6'3". I just don't trust it. Like I'm like no way. And I've just seen and heard of so many accidents. So
Sure. Well, Gio, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect and sharing your work.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me.
Gio Rutherford is an educator and content creator based in Wisconsin. Her TikTok is called Geodosaurus, where you can check out all of her videos about bodies of water, including her popular Spooky Lakes series. Stick around and we'll tell you how you can follow along as owlets hatch and learn to fly in a new Chirp Chat. Keep listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. This is Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Excret Nunez. March is nearly here, which means it's almost nesting season for barred owls. You might know the raptor for its iconic hoot. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you? For the second year, the Schlitz Audubon Nature Center will give people a look into the lives of barred owls with the Nest Box camera. Lindsay Foch is the Raptor Program Director at Schlitz Audubon. She says the live stream is part of the Nature Center's Barred Owl Monitoring Project. Foch joins me to share how people can watch online as owlets hatch this spring. So for this episode of Chirp Chat, I wanted to learn about the Barred Owl Nest Cam that'll be going live soon. But before we dive in, I was wondering if you can tell me about the barred owl and describe what it looks like.
So the barred owl is a Wisconsin native species. It's a medium to large sized owl. It is a tuftless owl, which means that it doesn't have those feather tufts on the top of its head. It's perfectly smooth. And in coloration, it is gray, whitish, with these dark vertical streaks on its chest. You can typically find barred owls in forested habitats, usually with older trees, older stands, and they also prefer wetlands and areas that are close by a pond or some kind of like standing water, primarily because of one of their favorite food sources, which are fish and crayfish. And then barred owls are a year-round resident of Wisconsin. So when they have set up a territory in our state, they stay there for almost the rest of their lives.
So the Nest Box Cam went live in March of 2025 last year. How did this project even come about in the first place?
Yeah, so the Nest Box camera that we've live streamed actually is kind of one branch, if you will, of Schlitz Audubon's larger barred owl monitoring project. That is a project that I work on with a wonderful partner, Dr. Bill Stout. We have been working on that since 2021, actually. So we found this new pair of barred owls that were in an area for the first time probably in decades, and it's in the Milwaukee area. So we decided we have a great opportunity to study the behavior and the habits of these wild owls in an urban setting. And so being able to look into this kind of extra special secret aspect of their lives and the nesting behaviors was one thing that kind of developed from this monitoring project. And then we found ourselves in the position where we could share it with the public last year.
Wow, that's amazing. So they've been here a while.
Yeah, a handful, right? It's been 5 years since their first sighting. Both of the birds are approximately 7 years old now.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, why barred owls, but it seems like the opportunity kind of presented itself.
Yes, yep, absolutely. And in this particular case, we're studying the habits of an owl species that there's not a lot of research done on. There is some, but especially in an urban habitat, there aren't a lot of studies out there right now that are published. And it gives us this great opportunity to figure out their land use, how they may change their territory size as the seasons go, their preferred diet, and then also, as equally as important, how well they play nice with others. And we found in the study for the last 5 years that this pair plays nice with others. They have great horned owl neighbors, they have red-tailed hawk neighbors, Cooper hawk neighbors, and everybody is doing very well.
Love to hear that. Yeah. And so the pair you've been observing, Betty and Maverick, how do you know they'll nest here again every year?
So our owl species, it's a natural behavior of theirs to have site fidelity. So they will return to the same nest or the same cavity every single year for our barred owls. So they come back midwinter every single year to check it out and rearrange some things and make sure that the same box is appropriate for next season. So we can reliably guess that they'll continue to come back. And it's not the same for other owls. Great horned owls, for example, won't use their own nests. What they do is they find red-tailed hawk nests or crow nests from last spring, and they'll just use it.
And I was wondering if you could walk me through the breeding season of a barred owl. How long is the process between building a nest to raising an owlet to be on their own?
So what we have found in studying Betty and Maverick is that mid to late winter, the two come together and really just solidify their bond. They're hooting together, duetting together, and reestablishing their territory, and then checking out their nest box or their cavity options. Egg laying occurs in mid-March. What'll happen is the female, she'll occasionally stop by the cavity and check it out and kick up the substrate and just make sure that it's kind of nice and cozy. And the duration of time where she's sitting will increase every day. And then suddenly she'll leave the box and there's an egg there. Owls will lay eggs at intervals. So there's 2 to 4 days between each egg that's being laid. Those eggs are then incubated for approximately 30 days. It's about a month. The eggs will hatch in that same order, and in approximately another month, the young will fledge or leave the cavity and take those first very brave leaps out onto the nearby branches. So Dr. Stout and I, we really start gearing up in November and keeping an eye on things and watching their behaviors and starting to collect more data. And then the young thus far have showed us that they will disperse from their parents' home territory around July or August, giving Betty and Maverick a good 4 to 5 months to rest until next year.
I'm Lake Effect's Excret Nunez, speaking with Lindsay Foch from the Schlitz Audubon Nature Center about their barred owl nest box camera. So I'd really love to learn more about the habits of a barred owl. I'm wondering, how does the female, in this case Betty, eat if she has to be incubating the eggs?
That was something that I really enjoyed learning from Betty and Maverick, in that while she is incubating, Maverick will do a lot of the hunting. What he does is he'll occasionally bring her food while she's incubating in the box, but more often he will return to the area where the box is and he will call to her. And she will actually leave the box to then go and retrieve food from him. She usually leaves on her own anyway if she has to relieve herself. She doesn't want to get the box messy. Once the eggs hatch, and there's so many more mouths to feed, Maverick will come to the box more frequently, so she does not have to leave the freshly hatched chicks as often. And that's always really fun to see too, is kind of like a family portrait. Yeah.
Love that. And that makes me wonder too, is like, how does the feeding situation work? Like, how do they feed their young if they tend to eat bigger fish or mammals or, yeah.
It's really captivating. So an adult barred owl can have a large bird and swallow it whole. Wow. But your little babies, they need some help first. So what'll happen is that mom, and in this case it's Betty, she'll have a prey animal and she will actually tear it into tiny little bite-sized pieces. The baby's eyes do not develop until they're maybe 2 or 3 weeks old is when they start to like open their eyes. So until then, she has these tiny little shreds of the meat where she will actually meet her beak with the baby's beak and place the food in the baby's mouth. And as the babies then are getting older and bigger, closer to the 3 to 4 week mark, Betty will actually leave whole prey items for these tiny little babies. Wow. And it's really something to see this tiny little puffball, right? That's like the size of maybe not even a cantaloupe, is swallowing this vole that's almost as big as its own head.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering too, like, how do the parents help owlets get ready to fly once it's time to leave the nest?
Yeah, because it's not necessarily inherent, and it can be pretty scary. So what we've observed is some of these hatchlings, some of these babies, when it's time, they are ready. Like they are amped, they are antsy, they're doing all their stretching and they're flapping in the nest and there's dust everywhere and they are ready to go. So there's not a lot of coaxing that is needed for some of these owlets. Others, though, are a little bit more nervous and they need a little bit more encouragement, from mom or dad. So what Betty will do is she will sit outside the box. The female will sit outside the cavity in a nearby branch, calling to the baby, and often with a mouse or something to try to entice it to come out. But in each case, each owlet has successfully fledged, and in a way, like Betty's kind of let them go at their own pace, but she does her part in trying to give them that courage to jump.
And is that something that people can watch from the camera?
Yes. So something that was one of my favorite parts of 2025 in our live stream with the public was that the first hatchling fledged very, very easily. And we were all cheering it on and we were so excited and because they jump up into the hole, the entryway, the doorway. And, and all of us are like, is it going to happen? Is it good? Is it? And they take the leap or they back out, and it can take days. And it's, and so we get to see the whole process through this live stream. So for this season, for 2026, we will go live with it when Betty is starting to show signs of egg laying. And so that will be announced on our website, on our socials, even through our e-newsletter, so people can sign up so that they can get these updates of our progress with it. And we will stream it all the way through when the chicks finally fledge and they have left the box. One question that we received a lot of last year is, do the babies ever return? And they do not. So once they take that first leap, they're out of the box.
That's incredible. And so they go on and
they just
live their life.
Yeah.
Well, Lindsay, we've reached the end of Chirp Chat, but before we wrap up, I always love to ask guests to shine a spotlight on a bird for the month. In maybe this case, a raptor. So what's a bird or a raptor you'd like to highlight this month?
It goes without saying, our feature bird for the month would be the barred owl.
And we have a barred owl with us today.
We do. Our wonderful Perseus is our raptor ambassador barred owl who lives here at Schlitz Audubon Nature Center. And Perseus was hatched out in the wild in 2018. Unfortunately, a storm came through and knocked her nest over when she was just a little owlet. But because of her exposure to people during that very young time, she unfortunately imprinted on humans. Would you like to meet her?
Yeah, I would love to meet her. Oh my gosh. Absolutely.
So as you can see, Perseus, she's a medium to large owl, or barred owl. The coloration just helps them blend in so very well as they're sitting out in a tree. They're perfect for to be a resident raptor. she's so fluffy. She just looks like a big fluffy potato. But what I like to tell, especially kids, because they can relate to it, is that our owls that stay here throughout the winter, it's like they're wearing their winter coats all year round. So that thick layer of feathers will keep them warm when it's cold outside.
Thank you both so much for being here today and telling me more about the wonders of barred owls and this amazing nest box camera project. I'm really excited for people to check it out.
Oh, and thank you for having us and featuring the box as well. We're very, very excited that we can bring it to the community and get people engaged with it and this wonderful, intimate look into nesting owls.
Lindsay Foch is the Raptor Program Director at the Schlitz Audubon Nature Center, and we spoke for this month's episode of Chirp Chat. You can find all of those conversations at wuwm.com or by downloading the Chirp Chat podcast. That's Lake Effect for today. I'm Excurette Nunez. Audrey Nowakowski, Joy Powers, and Sam Woods join me in producing Lake Effect each week, with help from Graham Thomas. Becky Mortensen is our executive producer, and Emily Files helps edit the show. We also heard from Mayan Silver, Eddie Morales, Catherine Kokel, and Jimmy Gutierrez from the WUWM news team this week. Jason Reevy is our studio engineer, Valeria Navarro Villegas is our digital operations manager, and Trapper Shep wrote our theme music. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at wuwm.com. And if you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Join us again on Monday at noon to learn about local businesses suing over the Trump administration's tariffs. Until then, thanks so much for joining us today on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.